So since my last video where I looked at an MSI OLED panel I purchased, I have completely ripped my setup apart again because I wasn't 100% happy with it because of its size and screen burn issues that could happen after the warranty period comes to an end. And if you wanted to see that, there will be a card in the corner. But the new monitor has turned up, I've got it set up, and no, it's not OLED. Well, at this point, I do feel like I'm the only one on YouTube right now that hasn't been entirely satisfied with OLED technology. But this time round, I've gone mini LED because you still get your local dimming and super contrasty HDR, but without, hopefully, any kind of screen burn issues. The monitor in question is the MSI MPG 274URDFWE16M, which quite frankly is the most disgusting model number I've ever heard in my life for any consumer product. But I suppose the question is really, am I impressed enough to keep the monitor this time round? Well, yeah, absolutely. I am way more impressed and happy with this than I was my last monitor, but am I completely 100% on it? No. And I know it does sound silly, but the monitors again do not line up because the bottom bezel on the new E16M monitor is just so much skinnier than my old monitor. However, for the slightly lower price, it's definitely something that I could get over. And now that I've gone the IPS route, I think it would be easy to get a second E16M and avoid all of the issues with screen burn if I were to go the OLED route. Now, my PC can be on for up to 15 hours or so a day because I work from home. And my second monitor is sitting on a static desktop for most of that time. And there could become a problem quite quickly if the start bar or the taskbar starts, or even my wallpaper actually starts burning into the screen. Anyway, this is all food for thought really for the near future. So in the meantime, let's get on with talking about my experience with my new E16M gaming panel, because I must say I am really having a great time with it in an unexpected way. Now, having local dimming capabilities means that contrast ratios can be a lot wider, and I must say after testing the OLED panel I've just had and now, the image quality achieved between the two to the naked eye is pretty negligible. Sure, the accuracy of OLED when it comes to dark and bright areas on the screen is a lot more accurate, and mini LED suffers from haloing around brighter areas. To me, when playing my games, I've not really noticed this in a massive way though. And there are settings to negate these issues, especially when using the monitor in its HDR mode. So looking at the loading screen on Ori and the Will of the Wisp, you can actually see that the haloing here is quite bad, though the camera, I will say, does exaggerate it quite heavily. Halo dimming does help somewhat, but because the contrast between Ori and the rest of the screen is just so stark, it means that haloing is just really prominent. Looking at a lantern here in Hunt Showdown, you can also notice haloing happening, but it is nowhere near as bad as, say, the loading screen on Ori and the Will of the Wisp. I think it is because the light source is so small within the scene. Now, Hunt Showdown is a dark game anyway, especially when you do go into buildings and houses and that kind of thing. What I am doing here at the moment is just turning down or turning up that halo dimming just to see if I can counteract it. I do usually run my monitor at around 60 to 70, maybe a little bit more in the halo dimming. And as you can see here, compared to what you've just seen, it has made a difference to that concentrated light source. So throwing this torch to create a larger light source, you can see that the haloing here is completely reduced. I am still running it on that 7 or around 70 on the halo dimming setting. And as you can see, there is no problem here. So as long as that halo dimming is controlled with the setting, you're not going to notice it really running around a map within a multiplayer game, or even a single player game for that matter, unless you are really, really looking for it. Now it comes with two settings, peak 400 and peak 1000, with the latter producing a super bright image. Now in HDR, your brightness setting is locked and you have to rely on your local and halo dimming settings, and local dimming set to level 3 worked best for me as it produced the most comfortable looking contrast difference. Set to level 2 or 1, then highlights do start to become really overexposed. However, saying this, when I plugged my Lenovo work laptop into the monitor, I turned off all of the local dimming features because it either made the image look far too contrasty on level 1 and 2, and for some reason really washed out on level 3. Now I will say I wasn't using HDR on my Lenovo work laptop. Now for halo dimming, I do set this between 70 and 80 to keep it really controlled. Now, it might get a little bit of backlash, but I am a fan of glow coming from bright areas of a scene. But if I turn off halo dimming completely, as in turn it down, it becomes really, really messy. And for the most part, I've not really noticed any major issues with haloing in the games that I do play anyway. Maybe I haven't had enough dark scenes in them with smaller highlight details to really notice. What I will say though is that games do look absolutely fantastic. Now, my go-to test with Ori and the Will of the Wisp, wow, it's a lovely game to play in HDR on this panel. And this is to let you know being played at the monitor's 4K 160Hz mode. It has also got 1080p 320Hz mode as well, but I've got no real need for 1080p gaming as esports aren't really my thing, outside a bit of Overwatch with my friends, but 160Hz is fine really for the type of games that I play. It also features G-Sync and FreeSync Premium compatibility through its adaptive sync tech, which does activate above 48Hz in its 4K mode and 180Hz in its 1080p mode. Now, the dual mode setting is alright though if you do have the need for it, and there's nothing really to complain about here. It's a fast refresh rate and has super smooth imagery, and it performs well in games like CS2, but I bought this monitor for 4K resolutions at a decent frame rate. And the local dimming with HDR content, which I must say, the monitor has exceeded my expectations, like again in Battlefield 6. So jumping back into Blackwell fields on this monitor, we tested it last time with the OLED panel and we found that the sunset over there was hugely overexposed. Now, the contrast between the dark and light areas was actually very, very nice, but the sunset itself over in the distance was just insanely overexposed. But I have found with this mini LED panel that sunset and other highlights are really, really well controlled. Now, inside of the settings menu, I am running HDR. If we go down to image itself, I've got a bit of sharpness on. Display HDR at 1000 nits, so really, really bright there. Local dimming at level 3. If I did change that, you can see the difference between them. Local dimming level 3 gives the best contrast between dark and light colors, the best contrast ratio. And then halo dimming I have at 70. So let's just jump over to the arches on the Cairo map again that we looked at before, because the brightness here compared again with looking at the OLED panel is very well controlled. Now, of course, we are not engulfed in as much shadow. It wasn't as dark, or it's not as dark in this underpass here as it was with the OLED panel. But the brightness looking out into the street is a lot more controlled as well. If you catch it off, like off center, this area looks a lot brighter. But if you look at it directly or you start heading towards it, it starts to become a lot more controlled. And that's the same that I noticed down here where we were before by this water tank. Everything gets super bright, but as you start approaching it, it becomes a lot more well controlled. When you go out into the street, looking at the rubble on the ground, everything just looks absolutely stunning, just looks fantastic. Now, of course, you aren't getting that heavy contrast between dark and light colors like you would in OLED. Jumping into my graphics menu and down to my HDR calibration, you can see we are still running at 31.3, and it just looks a lot more comfortable on the eyes when you actually look at the image itself. It's a lot less bloomy, if that makes sense, for lack of a better word. But overall, Battlefield 6 gives off a really, really nice experience on HDR on this monitor, on mini LED, as opposed to a fully OLED panel. To save a bit of time, it does have an overdrive mode, and throughout testing I found that its fast overdrive mode is by far the best setting to use across the board with response time and overshoot. Now, I used my OSRTT tool to test this, and a 4K 160Hz in its normal overdrive setting, I achieved an average initial time of 7.24 with a 40% in window, which isn't that great. The tool also failed to notice any kind of RGB overshoot in normal overdrive, which I didn't quite believe. It's good, don't get me wrong, but no matter what settings I changed on the monitor, it could not pick up any issues here, so I don't know why I'm complaining, but great. However, when upping the overdrive setting to fast, I did see some RGB overshoots start to creep in, with an average error of 4.3, which again, decent. Also, the average initial time fell to 4.87, which isn't too bad either, but it did only spend 0.33% in window. And finally, in its faster overdrive setting, the average initial time stayed the same really, though RGB overshoot increased to 12, which is still okay, but it isn't perfect. Now do let me know in the comments if you have had a different outcome to this. I've seen other reviews online of this panel claiming better results when it came to RGB overshoot, though I could not replicate them here. During a ghosting test, there wasn't any real difference between normal and fast overdrive settings, but based on the results of my OSRTT tool, fast would be the better option to go for. Faster and even the MPRT mode gave me some pretty solid ghosting trails, which I did not want to see in game. And also, if you are going to be playing esports titles, then you're going to need the fastest setting to ensure you're shooting at the right thing, which is the fast overdrive setting overall. Even though most of my testing was done in HDR with this screen because it looks fantastic, I did also want to mention using this panel in its SDR mode as well, because I feel like local dimming looks nowhere near as good or effective as in HDR. But I do guess I kind of expected that. Now, it does perform like a great IPS monitor would. Just don't expect the world from it would be my only advice. Now, I would personally turn off all local dimming in the settings for a uniform look if you're using this monitor to consume SDR content like I do with my laptop. Though I must say, on my gaming rig behind me, I do have my Windows HDR setting constantly switched on, except when editing videos because I mainly game on this screen anyway and do my day job on a laptop. And turning it on and off constantly when switching between work and gaming is just a faff. Now, it's not a bad monitor at all for work use, and text is really nice and sharp and clear. And using HDR when browsing online for social media didn't have much of an effect anyway, and I wouldn't think it would get in your way of working either. It's not enough for me to kick off about it anyway. Now, also, just to warn you, the monitor can get bright, so if you're finding it a little difficult to use long term, get your HDR switched off and get the brightness down to about 50 or 60 for comfortable viewing in its SDR mode. Color accuracy to the naked eye isn't bad either. There are a bunch of different image modes that you can run, but I have found my best settings are user or sRGB. Running my Data Color Spider X Elite in the user image mode, it gave me 100% sRGB, 100% Adobe RGB, 96% P3, and 98% NTSC color gamuts, and an average delta E of 3.14. In sRGB mode, it gave me 97% sRGB, 72% Adobe RGB, 72% P3, and 67% NTSC color gamuts, with an average delta E of 1.35, which is significantly better than the user mode. However, the gamuts fared worse. However, switching back to the user mode and switching on HDR gave me an average delta E of 1.49, which means this monitor's user HDR mode has some really super color accuracy, which is good because that's how I play games most of the time anyway. I ran two different tests for its brightness and contrast settings because of its local dimming capabilities, and with local dimming switched off, I did achieve a max brightness in SDR of 515.5 nits with a contrast ratio of 990:1, which wasn't great at all. However, switching the local dimming setting to level 3, the max brightness in SDR hit 424.8 nits, which is slightly dimmer, though the contrast ratio did achieve 3,660:1, which is huge in comparison, making me think that the level 3 setting should really be used for most applications on this monitor, whether consuming HDR or SDR content. Though, as I said at the start of this video with my laptop, it wasn't really the case. Screen uniformity and luminance uniformity I'm just going to touch upon because they were absolutely appalling across the board, which is to be expected really, and definitely bad comparing to the OLED panel I had, which was absolutely lovely. There were dark spots and light spots in both corners, and even with brightness uniformity switched on, it made no real difference at all. This, compared to my last OLED monitor, fared the worst test when it came to results, though in real time and while gaming, the faults with the E16M were not really noticeable. If your setup is anything like mine with the VESA monitor going on the wall, using its VESA 100 mounting capability, you're not actually going to see it to enjoy the unique design that this monitor does offer, which is a bit of a shame, especially if consumers are paying a premium for the design elements this monitor offers with the white back and classy RGB pattern. However, the bezels on front are still black, and yes, they do look impressively skinny, The whole RGB dotted pattern is a bit of an odd decision, and although it does look mighty impressive if you were to look at the back of your monitor, it offers no practical use to a setup like this. It doesn't even shine bright enough to produce a glow effect around the monitor either. It does though have a single DisplayPort 1.4a, two HDMI 2.1 ports for console gaming, and a Type-C port which can do up to 98 watt power delivery, but this does need switching on in the settings. And I will say again, with my Lenovo work laptop, the power delivery wasn't powerful enough to keep my laptop charged. There was a warning on the laptop saying you need to upgrade your charger essentially. The E16M I think is an absolutely solid choice for my setup. I'm absolutely loving the HDR capabilities with its local dimming. Now design wise it does look great, though like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, my monitors don't line up now. Yes, it is going to annoy me as time goes on, but I think for the quality that I'm getting, I can look past it for now until I can afford to get a second E16M on my desk anyway. Now I know that haloing has been a bit of a problem in cases, and it has been a bit of contention in other reviews, and yes, while local dimming and contrast differences aren't as accurate and pinpoint as OLED counterparts, the haloing effect really hasn't been a big deal to me and has only really affected the starkest of differences with contrast. Like, I don't know, for example, the loading screen in Ori and the Will of the Wisps. But if it bothers you that badly, then turn the halo brightness setting down. It's simple.